Sarah Martinez walked into the Blue Moon Bar after the longest day of her life. The corporate training seminar had run 3 hours overtime, and all she wanted was a quiet drink before heading home to her apartment. At 28, she had worked her way up from entry-level customer service to regional training director for a major consulting firm. Her specialty was leadership development and crisis management, skills that had taken her years to master through formal education, military reserve training, and real-world experience managing difficult situations. The bar was busier than usual for a Wednesday evening. Groups of office workers clustered around high tables, their voices mixing with the sound of clinking glasses and soft jazz music. Sarah chose a spot at the far end of the bar, away from the crowd, and settled onto a leather stool. She pulled out her phone to check messages while waiting for the bartender. "What can I get you?" asked Marcus, the bartender she had seen here before during her occasional visits. "Whiskey sour, please. And can you make it a double?" "It's been that kind of day." Marcus smiled knowingly and began mixing her drink. Sarah appreciated that he didn't try to make small talk. She wasn't antisocial, but tonight she needed a few minutes to decompress. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger sister asking about weekend plans. Sarah was typing a response when she heard loud laughter from a group of men several seats down from her. Initially, she paid them no attention. Groups of friends often got louder as the evening progressed, but something in their tone made her glance up from her phone. 4 men in expensive suits were gathered around the bar, each holding what appeared to be their 3rd or 4th round of drinks. They looked to be in their 30s or 40s, the type who probably worked in finance or real estate based on their polished appearance and confident demeanor. The tallest one, a man with perfectly styled brown hair and a navy suit, was telling what seemed to be a story about closing a big deal. His friends laughed at appropriate moments, but Sarah noticed their attention kept drifting toward other patrons in the bar. Their eyes lingered a bit too long on women walking by, and their comments, while not loud enough for most people to hear clearly, had an edge that made Sarah uncomfortable. She tried to focus on her drink and her phone, but her training and reading group dynamics made it hard to ignore what was happening nearby. During her military reserve weekends and leadership seminars, she had learned to identify potentially problematic situations before they escalated. The body language of these men suggested they were looking for trouble, even if they didn't realize it themselves. "Another round for my friends here," the tall man called to Marcus. "And make them strong. We're celebrating." "What's the occasion?" Marcus asked politely while preparing their drinks. "Closed the biggest deal of my career today," the man replied, puffing out his chest slightly. "Made more money in one afternoon than most people see in a year." Sarah caught the slight eye roll from Marcus as he worked. Bartenders dealt with boastful customers regularly, but they had to maintain professional courtesy. She felt a pang of sympathy for him, knowing he probably dealt with difficult patrons every night. As the men received their fresh drinks, their conversation grew louder and more animated. Sarah could now hear fragments of what they were saying, and her discomfort increased. They were rating women in the bar, making crude comments about appearances, and discussing their plans for later in the evening in ways that suggested they expected company whether it was welcomed or not. A young woman at a nearby table got up to use the restroom, and Sarah watched as the tall man's eyes followed her across the room. He said something to his friends that made them all laugh, and one of them made a gesture that was clearly inappropriate. The woman was oblivious to their attention, focused on her own conversation with friends, but Sarah felt her protective instincts activate. She had seen this behavior before during her college years and in various professional settings. Men who had too much to drink and felt entitled to attention from women often escalated their behavior throughout the evening. What started as crude comments usually progressed to unwanted approaches, and sometimes worse. Her training had taught her to recognize these patterns and intervene before situations became dangerous. Sarah finished her whiskey sour and considered her options. She could pay her bill and leave, avoiding any potential confrontation. That would be the safe choice, the one most people would make. But something about the atmosphere in the bar tonight felt different. The group of men seemed particularly aggressive, and there were several women dining or drinking alone who might become targets if their behavior continued to escalate. She decided to stay and observe for a while longer. If nothing happened, she would finish one more drink and head home. But if the situation developed in the direction she suspected it might, she wanted to be in a position to help if needed. The tall man finished his drink quickly and ordered another. His friends were keeping pace, and their volume continued to increase. Other patrons were starting to notice them, and Sarah saw a couple at a nearby table exchange concerned glances before deciding to move to a table farther away. "Excuse me, miss." Sarah looked up to find the tall man standing next to her stool. Up close, she could smell the alcohol on his breath and see that his eyes were slightly unfocused. He was trying to appear charming, but there was something predatory in his expression that immediately put her on alert. "I couldn't help but notice you sitting here all alone," he continued, uninvited, placing his hand on the bar close to her arm. "A beautiful woman like you shouldn't have to drink by herself. Why don't you come join me and my friends? We're having a great time, and we'd love some lovely company." Sarah had expected this moment might come, but she felt her heart rate increase nonetheless. She had dealt with unwanted advances before, but usually in more controlled environments like conference networking events where there were clear professional boundaries and security personnel nearby. This felt more unpredictable. "Thank you for the invitation," she replied calmly, "but I'm perfectly content here. I hope you and your friends have a good evening." She turned back toward her phone, hoping he would take the polite rejection and return to his group. But instead of leaving, he moved closer, positioning himself between her and the rest of the bar. "Come on, don't be like that," he said, his voice taking on a slightly more insistent tone. "We're successful guys. We know how to show a lady a good time. What do you say? Let me buy you a real drink." Sarah felt the familiar sensation of her training kicking in. Her breathing became more controlled, her posture straightened slightly, and her awareness of her surroundings sharpened. She could see Marcus watching the interaction while wiping down glasses, ready to intervene if needed. She could hear the man's friends encouraging him from their seats, and she could sense other patrons beginning to pay attention to what was happening. "I appreciate the offer," she said, making eye contact with him directly. "But I've already said no thank you. I'd like to finish my drink in peace." Her tone was firm, but not aggressive, designed to establish a clear boundary without escalating the situation unnecessarily. In her leadership training, she had learned that most conflicts could be de-escalated through confident, clear communication combined with appropriate body language. But this man was not most people. The alcohol had clearly impaired his judgment, and his friends were watching, which meant his ego was now involved. Instead of backing down, he leaned closer. "You know what I think," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I think you're just playing hard to get. I think you want attention, sitting here all dressed up with nowhere to go. Why else would you be here alone on a Wednesday night?" Sarah felt anger beginning to build, but she kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that showing emotion in confrontational situations often made things worse. Men like this one fed on reactions, whether positive or negative. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she replied evenly. "I'm here because I wanted a quiet drink after work. I'm not looking for company, and I'm not playing any games. I've politely declined your invitation, and I'd appreciate it if you would respect that." The man's expression changed then, becoming less charming and more openly hostile. Sarah recognized this shift immediately from her crisis management training. When people felt rejected or challenged, especially in public settings where they felt their reputation was at stake, they often became more aggressive rather than less. "Listen, lady," he said, his voice now carrying a clear edge. "I was being nice, trying to include you in our celebration. But if you want to be a stuck-up bitch about it, that's your choice. Don't expect any more friendly invitations." Several heads turned in their direction at the sound of his raised voice and the obvious insult. Sarah saw Marcus step closer, and she noticed two women at a nearby table looking concerned. The man's friends were now paying full attention, and she could hear one of them say something about putting her in her place. Sarah realized this was about to become exactly the kind of situation she had been trained to handle. But handling it in a corporate conference room with role-playing exercises was very different from dealing with drunk, entitled men in a crowded bar. Everything she did in the next few minutes would determine whether this ended peacefully or escalated into something much more serious. She took a slow, deep breath and prepared to put 4 years of leadership training and crisis management education to the test in a way she had never expected. Sarah remained seated on her bar stool, maintaining eye contact with the man who had just insulted her. Years of military reserve training had taught her that backing down from bullies often encouraged them to become more aggressive, but she also knew that direct confrontation could escalate situations beyond control. She needed to find the middle path that would establish her authority without triggering a larger conflict. "I understand you've been drinking," she said in a voice that carried just far enough for his friends to hear. "And sometimes alcohol makes people say things they don't really mean. This would be a good time for you to return to your friends and continue your celebration." Her tone was neither angry nor afraid. It was the same voice she used when addressing disruptive participants in corporate training sessions, calm, but with an underlying authority that suggested she was not someone to be trifled with. She had learned this technique from a former military instructor who had taught her that true authority came not from volume or aggression, but from quiet confidence and the ability to maintain control under pressure. The man stared at her for a moment, clearly surprised by her response. He had expected either fear or anger, both of which would have given him ammunition to continue the confrontation. Instead, he was faced with someone who seemed completely unruffled by his behavior, which threw off his planned approach. His friends, however, were not ready to let the situation die down. The shorter man with the receding hairline called out from their group, "Hey Tom, you going to let some random woman talk to you like that? She thinks she's better than us." Sarah immediately cataloged this new information. The tall man's name was Tom, and his friends were actively encouraging the confrontation rather than trying to defuse it. This meant the situation was likely to escalate rather than resolve naturally. She would need to take more active control before it spiraled completely out of hand. Tom's chest puffed out slightly at his friend's words, and Sarah saw his jaw clench. Male ego combined with alcohol and peer pressure created a dangerous combination that she had studied extensively during her conflict resolution courses. Men in groups often felt compelled to prove their dominance when challenged, especially in front of their friends. "You heard that?" Tom asked, leaning closer to Sarah again. "My friend thinks you have an attitude problem. And you know what? I'm starting to agree with him. Maybe someone needs to teach you some manners." Sarah felt a cold clarity settle over her mind, the same sensation she experienced during military exercises when a tactical situation shifted from practice to real danger. Every detail in the bar became sharper in her perception. She was aware of Marcus moving closer with a concerned expression, of the other patrons turning to watch the confrontation, of Tom's 3 friends standing up from their stools and beginning to move in her direction. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice now carrying a tone of command that made several people in the bar turn to look at her. "You have a choice to make right now. You can return to your celebration and pretend this conversation never happened, or you can continue down a path that's going to end very badly for all of you." The change in her demeanor was immediate and striking. Gone was any trace of the tired office worker who had walked into the bar an hour earlier. In her place sat someone who clearly had experience dealing with threatening situations, someone who spoke with the authority of a person accustomed to being obeyed. Tom blinked, momentarily taken aback by the transformation. But his friends were now standing behind him, and the crowd was watching. He had gone too far to back down gracefully, at least in his alcohol-impaired judgment. "Are you threatening us?" he asked, his voice rising. "Because if you are, lady, you picked the wrong guys to mess with. We don't take that kind of disrespect from anyone, especially not from some uptight bitch who thinks she runs the place." Sarah stood up slowly from her bar stool. She was not particularly tall at 5 feet 6 inches, but something in the way she moved commanded attention. Her posture was perfectly straight, her movements controlled and deliberate. When she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone who had been trained to take command in crisis situations. "Marcus," she said without looking away from Tom, "I think it would be a good idea to call security now." "Already on it," Marcus replied, reaching for the phone behind the bar. Tom laughed, but it sounded forced. "Security? For what? We haven't done anything wrong. We were just trying to be friendly to a lonely woman at the bar." Sarah smiled then, but it was not a friendly expression. It was the smile of someone who had just realized her opponent had made a critical tactical error. "You're absolutely right," she said. "You haven't done anything wrong yet. But you're about to." unless you make a smarter choice in the next 30 seconds. She turned slightly to address the crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation. Her voice carried easily across the bar, trained through years of addressing large groups in conference settings. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disturbance. These gentlemen have had too much to drink and are having difficulty accepting a polite refusal of their company. I'm hoping we can resolve this peacefully, but I want everyone to be aware of what's happening in case the situation escalates. The effect was immediate and devastating. By addressing the crowd directly, Sarah had transformed a private confrontation into a public incident. Every person in the bar was now watching Tom and his friends, waiting to see what they would do next. The social pressure was enormous, and even in his intoxicated state, Tom seemed to realize that continuing his aggressive behavior would make him look foolish in front of dozens of witnesses. But his friends were not ready to give up. The man with the receding hairline stepped forward, clearly agitated. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he demanded. "You think you can just announce our business to the whole bar? You don't know who you're messing with, lady." Sarah turned to face him directly, and her expression was like ice. "Actually," she said in a voice that carried absolute certainty, "I know exactly who I'm messing with. You're four men in expensive suits who think having money gives you the right to intimidate women. You're used to getting your way because most people are too polite or too scared to call you out on your behavior. But tonight, you picked the wrong person." She paused, letting her words sink in, then continued. "My name is Sarah Martinez. I'm a regional training director for Apex Consulting, and I specialize in leadership development and crisis management. I spent 4 years in the Army Reserve, and I've been trained to handle situations exactly like this one. So when I tell you that you're about to make a serious mistake, you should probably listen." The bar had gone completely quiet. Even the background music seemed muted compared to the tension in the room. Tom and his friends found themselves facing someone who was clearly not intimidated by their behavior, someone who had just publicly identified herself and claimed professional expertise in dealing with confrontational situations. Tom's friend looked uncertain for the first time since the confrontation had begun. He glanced at Tom, then at the crowd watching them, then back at Sarah. The alcohol was still affecting his judgment, but some part of his brain was beginning to recognize that this situation was not developing the way they had expected. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, which she placed on the bar where everyone could see it. "Apex Consulting, Regional Training Director, specializing in leadership development and crisis management," she said matter-of-factly. "I run seminars on exactly this type of situation for corporate executives who need to learn how to handle difficult personalities and de-escalate conflicts before they become legal problems." She looked directly at Tom's friend. "For example, right now, you're engaged in what's called group intimidation behavior. You're using the perceived safety of numbers to try to coerce someone who has clearly stated they want to be left alone. Depending on how far you decide to take this, you could be looking at charges ranging from harassment to assault." The man's face went slightly pale. The legal implications of their behavior apparently hadn't occurred to him before Sarah spelled them out. But Tom was not ready to concede defeat. The alcohol, the public humiliation, and the encouragement of his remaining friends combined to override whatever good judgment he might have possessed. "I don't care what your job title is," he said, stepping closer to Sarah again. "And I don't care about your fancy business card. You embarrassed me in front of everyone here, and nobody does that to me. Nobody." Sarah could see the moment when the situation shifted from a verbal confrontation to something potentially physical. Tom's body language changed, his fists clenched slightly, and his friends moved to flank her on either side. The crowd sensed the change as well, and several people began backing away from the bar area. This was the moment she had been trained for, the critical point where all her education and preparation would be put to the ultimate test. Sarah felt her heartbeat slow as her mind shifted into what her military instructors had called command mode, a state of heightened awareness and tactical thinking that allowed her to process multiple threat factors simultaneously. She had perhaps 10 seconds before Tom or one of his friends made a move that would force her to respond with more than words. Everything she did in those 10 seconds would determine whether she could maintain control of the situation or whether it would explode into the kind of violent confrontation that could result in serious injuries and legal consequences for everyone involved. Sarah looked Tom directly in the eyes and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but which somehow carried to every corner of the now silent bar. "Thomas," she said, using his full name deliberately, "you are about to find out what happens when you try to intimidate someone who has been professionally trained to deal with people exactly like you." The use of his full name had an immediate effect on Tom. Sarah had learned this technique during her psychology courses in conflict resolution. Using someone's formal name in a confrontational situation often triggered a subconscious response that reminded them of childhood authority figures, creating a moment of psychological uncertainty that could be leveraged to regain control. Tom hesitated, blinking as if he was trying to process how this woman knew his name was Thomas rather than just Tom. In that moment of confusion, Sarah seized the initiative. "Everyone in this bar is now a witness to your behavior," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Your faces are probably already being recorded by multiple cell phone cameras. Security is on the way. You have approximately 2 minutes to decide whether you want this evening to end with you going home to sleep off your drinks, or whether you want it to end with police reports and potential assault charges." She gestured toward the crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation. Indeed, several patrons had their phones out, and Sarah could see the distinctive red recording indicators on at least 3 devices. The age of social media had created a world where bad behavior could be preserved forever and shared with thousands of people within hours. "Marcus," she called to the bartender without taking her eyes off Tom, "could you please announce last call for these gentlemen? I think they've had enough for one evening." Marcus immediately understood her strategy. "Gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you to settle your tab and call it a night. The bar reserves the right to refuse service, and I think it's time for you to head home." This gave Tom and his friends a face-saving way to leave the situation. They could claim they were being asked to leave because of the bartender's decision, rather than because they had been intimidated by a woman who refused to back down. Sarah knew that preserving their ego while still achieving her objective was the key to avoiding a physical confrontation. But Tom's friend with the receding hairline was apparently too drunk or too stubborn to accept the graceful exit being offered. "We're not going anywhere," he declared loudly. "We've been coming to this bar for years, and we've never had any problems before. We're not about to let some uptight corporate bitch tell us what to do." Sarah felt a familiar coldness settle in her chest. This was the moment she had been dreading, when rational de-escalation tactics failed, and she would need to move to more direct methods of control. Her military training included techniques for physically subduing aggressive individuals, but using those skills in a civilian setting carried significant legal and personal risks. Instead, she decided to try one more psychological approach that she had learned during her corporate crisis management seminars. Sometimes, when dealing with individuals who were determined to create conflict, the most effective strategy was to remove their perceived power by demonstrating that they were not in control of the situation. Sarah pulled out her cell phone and held it up so everyone could see the screen. With deliberate, calm movements, she opened her contacts and scrolled to a number labeled City Police Non-Emergency. "Since you gentlemen have chosen to ignore multiple opportunities to leave peacefully," she announced in a voice loud enough for the entire bar to hear, "I'm going to call the police and request that they send officers to help resolve this situation. I'm sure they'll be interested to hear about your behavior tonight." The effect was immediate. Several patrons began pulling out their own phones, and Sarah heard one woman say she was calling her boyfriend who worked as a security guard. Another man announced that he had the license plate number of a BMW parked outside that probably belonged to one of the troublemakers. Tom's group suddenly found themselves faced with the prospect of multiple witnesses, recorded evidence of their behavior, and the imminent arrival of police officers. Even through the haze of alcohol, they began to realize that the situation had spiraled completely beyond their control. But, rather than backing down, Tom's anger seemed to intensify. His face reddened, and Sarah could see veins standing out on his forehead. She recognized the signs of someone whose fight-or-flight response had been triggered and who had chosen fight. "Put that phone down," he demanded, reaching toward her hand. You're not calling anyone. This was the moment Sarah had been preparing for since the confrontation began. The second Tom made physical contact with her or her property, the situation legally shifted from verbal harassment to potential assault. She had every right to defend herself, and her training provided her with multiple options for doing so effectively. But Sarah had spent years learning that the best victories were achieved without violence, that true leadership meant finding ways to resolve conflicts that left everyone's dignity intact. Even now, with Tom reaching for her phone, she decided to try one final strategy before resorting to physical intervention. She pressed the call button on her phone, and the sound of ringing could be heard clearly in the silent bar. Then, she activated the speakerphone function so everyone could hear when the police dispatcher answered. City Police Non-Emergency Line. How can I help you? Sarah spoke clearly and calmly into the phone. Yes, I'm calling to request officers at the Blue Moon Bar on 5th Street. We have a situation with 4 intoxicated men who are harassing patrons and refusing to leave when asked. The situation appears to be escalating, and I'm concerned about potential violence. Ma'am, are you in immediate danger? Not at this moment, but the individuals involved appear to be highly intoxicated and are becoming increasingly aggressive. I believe police intervention may be necessary to prevent the situation from getting worse. Officers are being dispatched now. Please stay on the line. The conversation was clearly audible to everyone in the bar, including Tom and his friends. The reality of police involvement suddenly sobered them in a way that Sarah's earlier warnings had not. The prospect of being arrested, of having to call lawyers or family members from jail, of having their names appear in police reports that could affect their professional reputations, finally penetrated their alcohol-impaired judgment. Tom's friend with the receding hairline grabbed his arm. Tom, we need to get out of here. Now, before the cops show up. For the first time since the confrontation began, Tom looked uncertain. The hand that had been reaching for Sarah's phone dropped to his side, and she could see him trying to calculate the consequences of staying versus leaving. Sarah recognized that this was the critical moment when she could either secure a peaceful resolution or watch the situation explode into something much worse. She made a decision that drew on everything she had learned about leadership, psychology, and human nature during her years of training and education. She ended the call to the police dispatcher and put her phone away. Then, she looked directly at Tom and spoke in a voice that was firm but no longer threatening. Gentlemen, you have exactly 1 minute to leave this bar voluntarily before the police arrive. If you go now, quietly, and without causing any more trouble, this ends here. No reports filed, no charges pressed, no permanent record of tonight's events. But if you're still here when the officers walk through that door, this becomes official, and there will be consequences that follow you long after the alcohol wears off. She paused, letting her words sink in, then continued with the tone of someone who was offering a final negotiation rather than making a threat. I'm giving you the opportunity to make a smart choice. Take it. Tom stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through anger, frustration, and, finally, a grudging recognition that he had lost this confrontation completely. Sarah had outmaneuvered him at every turn, maintaining control of the situation while giving him multiple opportunities to preserve his dignity. She had demonstrated a level of tactical thinking and leadership that he clearly hadn't expected to encounter. His friends were already moving toward the door, gathering their coats, and clearly eager to leave before the police arrived. The social pressure from the watching crowd, the threat of legal consequences, and the growing realization that they had badly miscalculated their opponent finally overcame their stubborn pride. This isn't over, Tom said, but his voice lacked conviction. It was the kind of empty threat that people made when they needed to save face while acknowledging defeat. Sarah looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. Yes, it is, she said quietly. It's completely over. And if you're smart, you'll make sure it stays that way. Tom stood there for another few seconds, perhaps hoping for some miracle that would restore his dominance of the situation. But the watching crowd, the empty bar stools where his friends had been sitting, and the sound of approaching sirens in the distance made it clear that his only rational choice was to leave. He turned and walked toward the door, his movements stiff with suppressed anger and wounded pride. His friends were already outside, and Sarah could hear them calling for him to hurry up. As he reached the exit, he turned back one last time, perhaps to deliver a final insult or threat. But when he saw Sarah watching him with calm, professional interest, as if he were a case study she was observing for future reference, whatever words he had planned died on his lips. He pushed through the door and disappeared into the night. The bar erupted in applause and cheering. Patrons who had been watching the confrontation surrounded Sarah, offering to buy her drinks and congratulating her on how she had handled the situation. Marcus came out from behind the bar to shake her hand, and several women approached to thank her for standing up to the group that had been making them uncomfortable all evening. But Sarah felt no sense of triumph or celebration. In her mind, she was already analyzing what had happened, identifying what she could have done differently, and considering what lessons could be extracted from the experience for future training seminars. This was how her mind worked, always learning, always improving, always preparing for the next challenge. The police officers arrived a few minutes later, and Sarah provided them with a detailed account of the evening's events. Several witnesses corroborated her story, and Marcus provided the officers with the names from the credit cards that Tom's group had used to pay their bar tab. The officers took notes and assured Sarah that they would follow up if any additional problems arose. But no arrests were made since the situation had been resolved without violence or property damage. As the crowd began to disperse and the bar returned to normal, Sarah found herself back on her original bar stool, finally, able to finish the drink she had ordered what seemed like hours ago. Her hands were steady, her breathing was normal, and, to any casual observer, she appeared completely unaffected by what had just occurred. But, inside her mind, Sarah was already thinking about how she would incorporate this real-world experience into her next leadership training seminar. 3 weeks after the incident at the Blue Moon Bar, Sarah stood in front of a conference room filled with 35 corporate executives attending her advanced leadership training seminar. The morning session had covered theoretical approaches to conflict resolution, but now it was time for the case study that would bring everything together. Leadership, she began, clicking to the next slide in her presentation, is often tested not in boardrooms or plan meetings, but in unexpected moments when everything you've learned must be applied under pressure. Today, I want to share with you a real-world example of crisis management that happened recently. She had spent considerable time deciding whether to include the bar incident in her training materials. Some colleagues had suggested it might be too personal or controversial for a corporate audience. But Sarah realized that the experience contained valuable lessons about leadership, psychology, and maintaining control in volatile situations that couldn't be replicated in role-playing exercises. 3 weeks ago, I found myself in a situation where 4 intoxicated men decided that my refusal of their company was unacceptable. What followed was a 20-minute demonstration of every principle we've discussed in this seminar, played out in real time with real consequences. The room was completely silent. These were seasoned executives who dealt with difficult personalities and high-pressure situations regularly. But something in Sarah's tone indicated that this was going to be unlike the typical corporate training scenarios they were accustomed to. The first principle we discussed this morning was situational awareness, Sarah continued. Before any crisis management can take place, a leader must be able to read the environment and identify potential problems before they escalate. She described how she had noticed the group of men at the bar, their body language, their increasing volume, and their inappropriate comments about other patrons. Several executives in the audience nodded in recognition, clearly remembering times when they had observed similar warning signs in business settings. The key here is understanding that problem behavior rarely appears suddenly, Sarah explained. There are almost always warning signs that can be identified by someone who knows what to look for. In corporate environments, this might be an employee who becomes increasingly hostile during meetings, a client who begins making unreasonable demands, or a colleague whose criticism becomes personal rather than professional. She clicked to the next slide, which outlined the escalation pattern that had occurred during the confrontation. The second principle is controlling the narrative. When someone attempts to intimidate or manipulate you, they're trying to force you into a reactive position where you respond to their agenda. Effective leadership requires maintaining control of the situation by setting the terms of engagement. Sarah described how she had refused to be drawn into an emotional response to the men's insults. instead maintaining professional composure and addressing the broader audience in the bar. This had transformed a private confrontation into a public incident, changing the dynamics completely. In business contexts, this might mean refusing to engage with someone who is shouting during a meeting, instead addressing the room as a whole about appropriate professional behavior. Or it could mean redirecting a hostile client's complaints into a structured problem-solving discussion rather than allowing them to vent indefinitely. A woman in the front row raised her hand. But what if the other person escalates their behavior when you don't respond the way they expect? Sarah smiled. That brings us to Principle 3, escalation management. When someone is determined to create conflict, your calm response often forces them to become more aggressive to get the reaction they're seeking. This actually works in your favor because it makes their inappropriate behavior more obvious to observers. She explained how Tom's increasing hostility had turned the crowd against him, making it clear to everyone present that he was the aggressor in the situation. This social pressure had become a powerful tool for resolution without requiring Sarah to use threats or physical intervention. The key is understanding that most bullies and manipulators rely on their targets being isolated and unsupported. When you make their behavior public and inappropriate, you remove that advantage. An executive from a technology company raised his hand. This sounds like it could work in some situations, but what about when you're dealing with someone who has actual power over you? A boss or a major client? Excellent question, Sarah replied. Power dynamics do change the equation, but the principles remain the same. The difference is in how you apply them. She described how even in hierarchical situations, maintaining professional composure, documenting inappropriate behavior, and ensuring that interactions had witnesses could protect against abuse of power. The key was understanding that true leadership meant being willing to take calculated risks to maintain ethical standards. Sometimes protecting yourself and your team requires being willing to escalate a situation to higher authorities, even when that carries professional risks. In the bar situation, I was willing to involve the police because the alternative was potentially much worse. A man near the back of the room leaned forward. But you could have just left the bar when you saw trouble developing. Wouldn't that have been safer? Sarah paused, considering how to address what was perhaps the most important aspect of the entire incident. You're absolutely right. I could have left, and that would have been the safe choice for me personally. But leadership often requires making decisions based on broader considerations than just personal safety or convenience. She explained how there had been other women in the bar that evening who might have become targets if the group's behavior had been allowed to continue unchecked. She described the responsibility that came with having specialized training and skills that could be used to help others. True leadership isn't just about managing your own team or protecting your own interests. It's about recognizing when you have the ability to make a positive difference in a situation and being willing to step up, even when it's not your responsibility. The room was quiet as the executives absorbed this concept. Many of them were accustomed to thinking about leadership in terms of corporate hierarchies and business objectives, but Sarah was describing a more fundamental type of leadership that transcended professional boundaries. The fourth principle is strategic thinking under pressure, she continued. When a crisis is developing, you rarely have the luxury of time to analyze all your options. You must be able to think tactically, considering multiple variables simultaneously and adapting your approach as conditions change. Sarah walked them through her decision-making process during the confrontation, explaining how she had constantly evaluated the threat level, the behavior of bystanders, the effectiveness of her responses, and the potential consequences of different courses of action. This type of tactical thinking can be developed through training and practice. Military personnel drill these skills constantly, but business leaders can benefit from similar preparation. Role-playing exercises, scenario planning, and crisis simulations all help develop the mental agility needed to perform under pressure. She described how her military reserve training had provided frameworks for assessing threats and maintaining calm during volatile situations. These same frameworks could be applied to business crises, whether dealing with hostile takeovers, public relations disasters, or internal conflicts. The final principle is knowing when and how to offer resolution, Sarah said, clicking to her last slide. Even when you've successfully established control of a difficult situation, True leadership requires finding ways to end conflicts that preserve everyone's dignity and prevent future problems. She explained how she had given Tom and his friends multiple opportunities to leave gracefully, even after their behavior had become clearly inappropriate. This wasn't weakness or capitulation, but rather strategic thinking about long-term outcomes. Humiliating your opponents, even when you have the power to do so, often creates enemies and future problems. Skilled leaders look for solutions that achieve their objectives while allowing other parties to maintain their self-respect. An executive from a pharmaceutical company raised her hand. But what if they don't accept the graceful exit you're offering? What if they're determined to fight? Sarah's expression became serious. Then, you follow through completely with whatever consequences you've established. The key is being prepared to back up your words with actions, and making sure those actions are proportional to the threat you're facing. She described how calling the police had shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation, providing external authority that the men couldn't challenge or ignore. In business contexts, this might mean involving human resources, legal departments, or senior management when other approaches failed. The most important thing is never making threats or promises you're not prepared to follow through on. Your credibility as a leader depends on consistency between your words and your actions. As the seminar concluded, several participants approached Sarah with questions about specific situations they were facing in their own organizations. A bank vice president wanted advice on dealing with a consistently hostile colleague. A startup founder asked about managing investors who were making unreasonable demands. A nonprofit director sought guidance on addressing board members who were undermining her authority. In each case, Sarah was able to draw connections between the principles demonstrated in the bar incident and the specific challenges they were facing. The real-world nature of her experience provided credibility that theoretical examples couldn't match. Over the following months, Sarah continued to refine her presentation about the incident, incorporating feedback from seminar participants and additional insights from her ongoing research into crisis management and leadership psychology. The story became one of her most requested case studies, used in training programs across multiple industries. But perhaps the most significant impact of the experience was on Sarah herself. She had always been confident in her professional abilities, but successfully handling such a volatile real-world situation had given her a new level of self-assurance that carried over into every aspect of her work. 6 months later, when Sarah was promoted to National Training Director and tasked with developing crisis management programs for Fortune 500 companies, she knew that her credibility in the role was built on more than just academic knowledge and corporate experience. She had proven to herself and others that when everything she had learned was put to the ultimate test, she could maintain control, protect others, and achieve positive outcomes even in the most challenging circumstances. The incident at the Blue Moon Bar had started as an unwanted intrusion on a quiet evening after work. But it had become something much more significant. A defining moment that confirmed Sarah's ability to lead under pressure and established her reputation as someone who could handle any crisis with skill, courage, and integrity. And while she hoped never to face such a situation again, Sarah knew that if she did, she would be ready. Because true leadership wasn't just about managing people in controlled environments. It was about standing up when it mattered, protecting those who needed protection, and maintaining your principles no matter what challenges arose. The 4 men from that evening had taught her something valuable, though probably not what they intended. They had shown her that all her training, education, and preparation had prepared her for exactly the kind of unexpected test that real leaders eventually face. And when that test came, she had passed it completely. That knowledge would stay with her for the rest of her career, a quiet confidence that came from knowing she could handle whatever challenges might arise. Because sometimes, the most important leadership lessons weren't learned in classrooms or conference rooms, but in moments when everything you believed about yourself and your abilities was put to the ultimate test. And sometimes, those moments happened in places you least expected them, with stakes you never anticipated, against opponents who had no idea what kind of person they were trying to intimidate. In the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all, that true leadership meant being ready for anything, anywhere, at any time. And Sarah Martinez was ready.